today, new Australian terror laws and French ditto start approaching Russian and Chinese mindset of justice. Your host is Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Good evening and welcome to Liberties Report Week 39. This week the world has taken a world for the definite Kafkaesque, to the point where it wouldn't do Kafka justice anymore. Australia is preparing new so-called anti-terror laws that can only be described as the exact opposite: terror laws.
The Australian administration is preparing a new set of terror laws that will let secret police surveil anybody, anytime and anywhere. A single warrant is required to monitor the entire internet. Burden of proof is reversed, so you may have to prove you're not a terrorist, with evidence against you possibly withheld. Taking part in terrorist organizations, as designated by the administration, is criminal in any way, including encouraging their activity on social media for a private crowd. Meanwhile, the secret police has complete immunity for their actions.
And it gets even worse. In the Supreme Court in one of the Australian states, when New South Wales, the state where Sydney is located, an order has been issued to use such anti-terror laws that prohibits any kind of reporting on the order, including who issued the order. So we're not just approaching secret courts with secret evidence where you're not even informed of your charges or the evidence against you, as was the case in Kafka. We're already there. And past that point, nobody else is informed either. In other words, it's not just the legislative branch that wants to do as it damn well pleases without any kind of accountability. It's the executive and judicial branches too. All three working in collusion in this direction. And as for terror organization, it's important that it's not just Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, that is neither Islamic nor state we're talking about here. Anything the government doesn't like is called terrorism these days. For a wake-up call, the peaceful Occupy London protests outside the London Stock Exchange were formally described as low-level terrorism. So if you appreciate them on Twitter or Facebook, you could be guilty over the above laws and arrested. Or for that matter, you could be arrested anyway, as a warrant is no longer required under these changes. France, meanwhile, is announcing changes in the same direction, even if not as far-reaching. The French government is taking itself the right to ban citizens from leaving the country, to restrict freedom of the press from glorifying terrorism, whatever that means, and creating new criminal offenses of visiting terrorist websites. So if you're visiting the wrong website, you might be a terrorist. And of course, the usual swath of censorship. Meanwhile, though, surprisingly refreshing, Russia is blunt and upfront. Putin demands Twitter, Facebook and Google to store their data within Russian borders and to comply with the harsh Russian restrictions in freedom of speech. Now, before you read what those restrictions are, you need to understand that it doesn't matter what the law says. Russian approach to justice is simply might makes right, and if you disturb or embarrass those in power, you're guilty of a crime. It doesn't matter so much what the actual title of the criminal code is for that crime. That's not just how it works in that mindset. China has a similar approach. You're allowed to say pretty much what you want unless it gets attention. So you're not allowed to embarrass those in power, quite regardless of how you do it or whether you do it intentionally. At this point, it's not hard to see that Russia and China have a completely different approach to rule of law than the West. Or do they really now? What's happening unspokenly in Australia can be seen throughout the Western world if you just look for it. The rule of law is changing. It is changing to secrecy. You're not allowed to see court evidence, you're not allowed to watch court proceedings, you're not even allowed to know the charges against you, nor the evidence to base those charges. At the same time, law enforcement is getting increasing powers to use violence against you to enforce a law. You're not even allowed to know what it says. So let's rephrase that. Rule of law is changing to make rule of law itself secret, which in turn obviously makes its enforcement completely arbitrary for all practical purposes. And not just that, the rules around law enforcement are also changing to give police greater powers, more discretion, and above all, less accountability. We've mentioned Ferguson a number of times here, where citizens were shot dead by police officers, unprovoked, in the open street, and with those police officers were not charged with murder. The Western world is changing its judicial system to one of might makes right and don't embarrass power, just like the systems that Russia and China have. And they're doing so in full daylight, with unfortunately few reporters seeing and telling what's going on. The best place to hide something terrible seems to still be to hide it in plain sight, as is happening here. This is not Kafka. This is far, far beyond anything Kafka wrote, or Orwell for that matter. I'm Rick Falkvinger, and this is Liberties Report. Visit our sponsor, Private Internet Access. Good night.
This report is presented by Private Internet Access.
Liberties Report is produced using exclusively free software.